When I first bought my small orchard on the outskirts of a cozy suburban neighborhood, I thought I'd found my dream sanctuary. I'd been looking for a quiet retreat for years, a place where I could grow my own produce, enjoy the fresh air, and get away from the noise of city life. The orchard wasn't huge, just a few acres, but it was mine, and that made all the difference. What I didn't realize at the time was that this paradise came with a catch, an HOA led by Karen. Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, didn't waste any time making her presence known. She arrived at my door just days after I moved in, clipboard in hand, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said, her voice dripping with fake enthusiasm. "I'm Karen, the HOA president. I thought I'd stop by to let you know about our community guidelines. You'll find them all in this binder." She handed me a binder that must have weighed 10 pounds. It looked more like a textbook than a neighborhood guide. I thanked her and assured her I'd review the rules, but even as I closed the door, I had a sinking feeling. Something about Karen screamed control freak, and I wasn't wrong. A few months passed, and I'd settled into a peaceful routine. I'd start my mornings with coffee on the porch, tending to the orchard during the day, and enjoying the quiet evenings under the stars. Then one afternoon I noticed something strange near the edge of my property, a gate. It wasn't just any gate. It was an elaborate iron monstrosity with the HOA's logo welded onto it. At first I thought it must be a mistake. Surely they wouldn't just install a gate on my property without asking. But when I walked over to inspect it, I found a freshly poured concrete base and a padlock. I called Karen immediately. She answered on the first ring, as if she'd been expecting my call. "Oh, that gate?" she said, her tone airy. "It's part of a new community initiative to improve security. We're installing gates on all neighborhood access points." "But this isn't an access point," I argued. "This is my land. My orchard isn't part of the HOA's jurisdiction." Karen's laugh was as cold as it was dismissive. "Actually, it is. The HOA's property map was recently updated, and your orchard is now considered a shared community space. You should have received a notice." I hadn't received any notice, and I said as much. Karen brushed it off, claiming it must have been lost in the mail. She assured me the gate was for everyone's benefit, and hung up before I could argue further. Something about the situation felt off. I spent the next few days going through every document I had about the property. I double-checked the deed, the survey maps, and even called the county office to verify the boundaries. Everything confirmed what I already knew. The orchard was mine, and the HOA had no claim to it. But Karen didn't see it that way. In the weeks that followed, I received letter after letter from the HOA, each one more aggressive than the last. They claimed I was in violation of community guidelines by restricting access to a shared amenity, and threatened to fine me if I didn't comply. I tried reasoning with Karen again, but she refused to listen. "The board has already made its decision," she said. "If you want to challenge it, take it to court." So that's exactly what I did. By the time we got to court, I was ready to present my case with a mountain of evidence that left no room for doubt. My lawyer and I had spent countless hours preparing every detail. I had copies of the original property maps, deeds proving my ownership, correspondence showing I had never agreed to join the HOA, and even statements from my neighbors who were just as baffled by Karen's audacity as I was. Meanwhile, Karen sat across the courtroom with a smug expression, clutching a flimsy HOA map that conveniently included my orchard. As the judge entered the room, the tension was palpable. Karen's lawyer tried to start with an air of confidence, asserting that the HOA had every right to manage the orchard as part of the community. But the judge, an older man with a no-nonsense demeanor, quickly interrupted. "We're here to determine ownership, not to entertain general claims about HOA authority. Let's stick to the facts." Karen's smugness faltered, and I couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. When it was my lawyer's turn, she methodically laid out our case, starting with the property maps. She pointed out the clear boundary lines that excluded my orchard from any HOA jurisdiction. The judge leaned forward as my lawyer passed the maps to him, nodding thoughtfully as he examined them. "These documents seem pretty straightforward," the judge remarked, his tone skeptical toward Karen's side. Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her bravado beginning to crumble. Next, we presented the correspondence. Emails and letters were entered into evidence, each one reinforcing that I had never agreed to join the HOA or allow them to manage my property. The nail in the coffin came when we submitted statements from my neighbors who corroborated my claims and described how Karen had been pressuring them to comply with similar overreaching demands. The judge's eyebrows rose as he read through the documents. "This is concerning," he said, looking directly at Karen. "It appears the HOA has overstepped its boundaries." Karen's lawyer tried to pivot, claiming that the HOA's intent was to improve the community and that any misunderstandings were minor clerical errors. But the judge wasn't having it. "Intent doesn't override property law," he said firmly. "The evidence presented here shows clear ownership by the plaintiff. The HOA acted without proper authority." Karen's face turned a deep shade of crimson as she fidgeted with her papers, clearly grasping for anything to salvage her case. The final blow came when the judge addressed Karen directly. "Miss Karen, your documents don't hold up under scrutiny," he said, holding up the questionable HOA map. "This map is unverified and inconsistent with the official property records." Karen stammered something about miscommunications and clerical errors, but her voice wavered, and it was clear even she didn't believe her excuses anymore. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. "This property clearly belongs to the plaintiff, and the HOA has no right to alter or claim it without consent," he declared. He ordered the immediate removal of the gate and ruled that the HOA was liable for all legal fees and damages. As the words left his mouth, I felt an overwhelming wave of relief and triumph. The months of stress, anger, and sleepless nights had finally paid off. Karen's expression was priceless, a mix of shock, embarrassment, and barely concealed rage. She tried to argue one last time, but the judge silenced her with a raised hand. "This ruling is final," he said sternly. "I suggest the HOA focus on adhering to property laws moving forward." Karen's head hung low, and she muttered something under her breath as she shuffled out of the courtroom, her defeat written all over her face. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. My orchard was safe, my rights had been upheld, and Karen's reign of terror had taken a significant hit. Watching that gate come down was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. Neighbors cheered as the concrete base was jackhammered into rubble, and I finally felt like my orchard was my own again. But the saga wasn't over. A few days later, I ran into one of Karen's former allies at the local hardware store. "You've really stirred things up," he said with a chuckle. "Karen's not happy about losing, but she's already moving on to her next project. Something about a woodland retreat and a hot tub." I couldn't help but laugh. Karen's antics were far from over, and it sounded like someone else was about to find themselves in her crosshairs. What I didn't realize at the time was that her next target would hit closer to home than I expected. Not surprised, though, as Karen's obsession with control takes an even more absurd turn when she decides to install a hot tub on someone else's property without permission. Stay tuned for the drama, the laughs, and the ultimate showdown. After the showdown with Karen and her illegal gate on my orchard, I thought I'd seen the worst of her antics. Little did I know, Karen's crusade for control was far from over. While I savored the victory of reclaiming my land, Karen had already set her sights on a new project, and it was one that would leave me utterly baffled. This time, the battle wasn't over fences or gates. It was over my woodland retreat, a small, secluded property about 20 minutes away from the orchard. It was my personal escape, a cozy cabin nestled in the trees where I could disconnect from the world. I'd owned it for years, and it had always been off the radar of Karen and her HOA mischief. That is, until now. One crisp Saturday morning, I decided to head out to the cabin for a weekend of relaxation. As I approached the property, something felt off. The usual serenity was replaced by a strange mechanical hum in the air. At first, I thought it might be someone working on a nearby property, but as I rounded the final bend in the road, my jaw dropped. There, in the middle of my yard, was a massive hot tub. Surrounding it was a crew of contractors, hammering away at a wooden deck that hadn't been there the last time I visited. "What the hell is this?" I shouted as I pulled up. The workers froze, staring at me like deer caught in headlights. A man with a clipboard approached cautiously. "Are you the homeowner?" he asked. "Yes, and I have no idea what's going on here. Who authorized this?" He glanced at his clipboard, then back at me, his expression a mix of confusion and panic. "We were hired by the HOA. They said this area was being developed as a community relaxation spot." "Community relaxation spot," I repeated, my voice rising. "This is private property." I didn't have to guess who was behind this. Karen's fingerprints were all over it. I called her immediately, and to my surprise, she answered on the first ring. "Oh, hello," she said cheerily as if nothing was wrong. "Karen, why is there a hot tub being installed on my property?" There was a pause, then her tone turned defensive. "Well, the HOA decided this area would be a great addition to our community amenities. It's perfect for a relaxation zone, don't you think?" "Karen, this isn't HOA property," I snapped. "This is my land. You can't just decide to build something here without my permission." Karen sighed dramatically, as if I were the unreasonable one. "Technically, the HOA map includes this plot as part of our jurisdiction. We're doing this for the good of the community." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "This property has nothing to do with the HOA. It's not even in the same zip code as the neighborhood." Karen dismissed my protests with her usual flippant attitude. "If you have an issue, you can take it up with the board, but the hot tub stays." At this point, I was seething. Not only had Karen trespassed on my land, but she'd also hired contractors to install a luxury feature I didn't want or need. I wasn't going to let her get away with it. I started by contacting my lawyer, who confirmed what I already knew. Karen had no legal grounds to claim my property. He advised me to file a cease and desist order against the HOA and take photographic evidence of the construction. But I needed more than just legal action. I needed to expose Karen's latest stunt to the community. I reached out to Violet and Josephine, my neighbors from the orchard debacle, and shared what was happening. They were just as outraged as I was. "She's completely lost her mind," Violet said. "We have to let everyone know what she's up to." Together we organized a neighborhood meeting. This time we invited residents from the orchard area and anyone who'd had run-ins with Karen before. At the meeting, I laid everything out: the hot tub, the unauthorized construction, and Karen's ridiculous claim that My Woodland Retreat was HOA property. I showed photos and shared the contractor's statements about being hired by the HOA. The room buzzed with murmurs of disbelief and anger. For many, this was the final straw. Karen's pattern of overreach was becoming impossible to ignore. "She's using HOA funds for her personal projects," one neighbor said. "She's acting like she owns everyone's property," another chimed in. Karen, of course, didn't attend the meeting, but word of the backlash spread quickly, and it wasn't long before she tried to do damage control. With the community on my side and my lawyer in my corner, I decided to take Karen and the HOA to court for trespassing, property damage, and unauthorized construction. I'll admit, I was nervous. Taking legal action wasn't something I'd done before, and the prospect of facing Karen's smug demeanor in a courtroom made my stomach churn. But as I reviewed the mountain of evidence we'd gathered, photos, emails, and witness statements, my determination grew. This wasn't just about the hot tub anymore. It was about standing up to someone who thought they were above the rules. As the trial began, Karen walked into the courtroom with her usual air of misplaced confidence. Dressed in an overly formal suit, she looked ready to charm her way out of trouble. But her bravado quickly faltered when my lawyer opened with a detailed timeline of her actions. He laid out everything, from the unauthorized construction on my property to her misuse of HOA funds. The courtroom was silent except for the occasional gasp from the audience, many of whom were my neighbors who had come to show their support. When it was Karen's turn to speak, she tried to paint herself as a misunderstood leader. "I was only acting in the best interest of the community," she said, her voice dripping with faux sincerity. "The hot tub was meant to improve our neighborhood, to bring us all together." But when my lawyer presented bank statements showing payments from the HOA account to Karen's personal account, the atmosphere shifted. The judge's eyebrows shot up, and Karen's face turned as red as a tomato. The highlight of the trial came when we introduced emails between Karen and the construction company. In these messages, Karen explicitly instructed them to bill the HOA for the hot tub and deck, while ensuring the invoices looked like they were for general maintenance. The judge read the emails aloud, and Karen's excuses unraveled further. "It's not what it seems," she stammered, trying to regain control, but it was too late. The evidence was irrefutable, and her web of lies was collapsing around her. As the trial progressed, my emotions were a mix of anger, vindication, and disbelief. Seeing Karen squirm under the weight of her own actions was satisfying, but it also infuriated me that she thought she could get away with such blatant wrongdoing. My neighbors shared my outrage. Many of them whispered their disbelief as more details came to light, especially when it was revealed that Karen had funneled thousands of dollars from the HOA account into her personal savings. When the verdict was finally delivered, it felt like the weight of the world had been lifted off my shoulders. The court ruled decisively in my favor, ordering the HOA to remove the hot tub and deck immediately and pay for all damages to my property. Karen, on the other hand, faced severe consequences. She was fined heavily for mismanagement of HOA funds and stripped of her position as president. The look on her face as the judge announced the penalties was priceless, a mix of shock, humiliation, and defeat. Watching that hot tub get hauled away was almost as satisfying as seeing the gate removed from my orchard. Karen's reign of terror was finally over, or so I thought. As I celebrated with Violet and Josephine, they shared a rumor that Karen was now meddling in a nearby condo complex, claiming she had the authority to sell units without the owner's consent. I laughed it off at first, but something told me this wasn't the last I'd hear of Karen. In the final story, Karen's antics reach a new level of absurdity when she tries to sell a condo that doesn't belong to her. Stay tuned to see how this saga ends with one final showdown. After Karen's disastrous hot tub fiasco, I thought I'd seen the peak of her overreach. But true to form, she wasn't done wreaking havoc just yet. As the dust settled from the Woodland Retreat debacle, I found myself entangled in Karen's most audacious stunt yet, a scheme so outrageous it left me questioning how she ever thought she'd get away with it. This time, Karen's target wasn't just a property I owned, it was one I had just purchased, a condo in a nearby complex that I hadn't even had a chance to move into yet. It all started with a routine trip to finalize some details with the condo's property manager. I was excited to finally turn the place into a cozy getaway spot. But as I pulled into the parking lot, something seemed off. There were moving trucks outside my unit. Workers were hauling furniture and boxes into the condo I had just bought. My condo. I parked my car and approached one of the movers, trying to keep my voice steady. "Excuse me, what's going on here?" The man glanced at me with a raised eyebrow. "We're moving in the new owner," he said, gesturing toward the open door. "The new owner?" My stomach dropped. "I'm the owner of this unit." The mover looked as confused as I felt. "You might want to take that up with the HOA," he said. I stormed into the unit, where a woman was directing movers and unpacking boxes as if she owned the place. When I asked who she was, she introduced herself as the new owner. "No, you're not," I said, my voice rising. "I just bought this condo. I have the deed and everything." She looked just as surprised as I was. "The HOA told me it was available. I paid for it through them." My mind raced. There was only one person who could be behind this, Karen. I drove straight to the HOA office, determined to get some answers. And sure enough, Karen was there, sitting at her desk with her usual air of smug authority. "Karen," I said, barely containing my anger, "what did you do?" She looked up, feigning innocence. "I'm not sure what you mean," she said sweetly. "You know exactly what I mean," I snapped. "You sold my condo to someone else." Karen's expression hardened. "There must have been some kind of mix-up," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "That unit was listed as available on our records." "Your records are wrong," I shot back. I own that condo. I have the deed, and you had no right to sell it. Karen shrugged. If there's a problem, you can take it up with the board. I wasn't about to let Karen brush this off as a simple mistake. I contacted my lawyer immediately, and we started digging into the situation. The more we uncovered, the worse it got. Karen had listed my condo as available without ever verifying the ownership records. She had pressured the HOA board into approving the sale, claiming it was for community improvement. And most damning of all, she'd pocketed a hefty administrative fee from the transaction. When we confronted the board, several members admitted they had been misled by Karen. She told us the previous owner abandoned the unit, one member said. We had no idea she was lying. Armed with a mountain of evidence, my lawyer and I prepared for the legal showdown against Karen and the HOA. The case quickly became the talk of the town, with whispers spreading through the community and even catching the attention of local media outlets. It wasn't every day that an HOA president got taken to court for selling a property she didn't own. As we entered the courtroom on the first day, I couldn't help but feel a mix of nerves and determination. This wasn't just about my condo anymore. It was about standing up to someone who thought they were above the law. Karen arrived with her typical smug demeanor, flanked by her attorney, who looked as if he was already regretting taking her case. As proceedings began, Karen wasted no time playing the victim. She claimed the entire debacle was a misunderstanding, a simple clerical error on the HOA's part. With crocodile tears in her eyes, she insisted she only wanted to improve the community and blamed me for blowing things out of proportion. My stomach churned as I listened to her lies, but I knew the truth would come out. When our turn came, my lawyer presented a meticulously organized case, starting with the fabricated documents Karen had used to justify the sale. The courtroom grew silent as damning emails were read aloud, showing Karen's deliberate attempts to bypass proper procedures. The tension rose further when bank records were displayed, revealing the hefty administrative fee Karen had pocketed for herself. But the final nail in her coffin came when the movers testified. One by one, they described how Karen personally orchestrated the sale, overseeing the process as if she were the rightful owner. Seeing Karen squirm in her seat was a small but satisfying victory. The judge's verdict was swift and scathing. He dismissed Karen's claims of innocence, calling her actions a blatant abuse of power and a calculated attempt to defraud. She was ordered to pay substantial damages, including my legal fees, and the sale was voided entirely. The new owner was refunded, and my ownership of the condo was officially restored. As the gavel struck, I felt a wave of relief and triumph wash over me. Karen's downfall was complete, and justice had finally been served. The fallout from the trial was swift and brutal. Karen was removed from her position as HOA president, and the board dissolved shortly afterward. Residents demanded reforms to prevent anything like this from happening again. As for Karen, her reputation was in shambles. She faced criminal charges for fraud and embezzlement, and her name became a cautionary tale in the community. Standing in my condo after everything was resolved, I felt a sense of relief and triumph. It had been a long, exhausting battle, but I had stood my ground and won. Karen's reign of terror was finally over, and I could finally enjoy the properties I had fought so hard to protect.